living fully alive in every way. You're listening to Relationship Prescriptions with Dr. Carol.
How do you feel about church? This is Dr. Carol, and you're listening to Relationship Prescriptions. Church can bring up a wide variety of feelings, positive, negative, the good, bad, the ugly. We know that church has been a absolutely vital part of Christian experience for millions of people, is today, has been for 2,000 years. We also know that church has brought real pain. Perhaps you have experienced some of that pain. Perhaps you have felt criticized, judged, hurt, rejected by church. Is it worth continuing? At my core, I come back to what Jesus said, I will build my church. It's his church, it's not our church. And all the human variations and the dysfunctional family dynamics, if I can say that many churches display, is part of what's real. It's messy. But that there are some fundamental things about church that we do not dare give up on. My guest today, Kevin Makins, has wrestled with some of those very questions. His recent book, Why Would Anyone Want to Go to Church?, addresses some of these from the perspective of a pastor who, with some friends, has built a church that did not start out looking like what most of us might think of as church. He continues to wrestle with these very kinds of questions. Now, for whatever differences Kevin and I may have on certain theological points, this we agree on, that church was God's idea and it's worth pursuing. I think you will find this conversation both encouraging and challenging. When we have spent years, decades for many of us in church, we can easily forget the core, the things at its root that Jesus was after when he started this whole thing of church. And forgetting that, we can get distracted. So this, I believe, will be challenging in a good way. Kevin Makins is the founding pastor of Eucharist Church in downtown Hamilton, Ontario. That church has been recognized as one of the most creative and innovative churches in the country. He is a frequent speaker. He's been on national television and radio outlets. He has produces frequent YouTube videos, and he's got a podcast, all kinds of good things that Kevin is doing. Most recently, his book, Why Would Anyone Go to Church?, is eye-opening. It's a human story of what life together following Jesus looks like here and now. I think you will enjoy this conversation. So here is Kevin Makins. Well, Kevin Makins, what a pleasure to have you on the program today as founding pastor of Eucharist Church and author of Why Would Anyone Want to Go to Church? I think this is such a critical time to talk about these issues and love some of your perspectives. So first, just a huge thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. It's been fun to connect with so many different people over the book.
I'd like to maybe give our listeners a snapshot of a bit of what brought you to this in the beginning. You planted a church that in some ways looks quite different than what many of our listeners might have expected. And I'd just like you to share a little of the very real story about how you came to where you are and what God did in bringing this church together as it is.
Yeah, well, I mean, in some ways, our church now looks very much like a normal church, and in other ways, it looks very different and quirky. But yeah, for me, a lot of it started when I was raised in the church, but I was not raised in a culture where many people went to church. So I'm in Southern Ontario, and for most of my life, until I was like 17, I didn't know another person that went to church, except for my cousins and like the two other kids in our little Lutheran church. So for me, this was all kind of, we were the weird ones. Nobody else went to church, and I totally made sense to me because church was strange. And, I enjoyed being a part of the church when I was a kid, but it was weird. And it wasn't until I was, 17, 18 years old when I realized there were Christians everywhere. There were lots of them. And that all of them, were engaging, or many of them were engaging in church. And around that time, I kind of had this faith awakening when I was in late high school, and understood that I wanted to follow Jesus, understood that community was important, but didn't really know what the church meant in that, what it kind of fit, what it fit like. And so it was through my own process of learning to love the church and learning to appreciate what the church could be that I realized that the medium of church was more vital than ever. It wasn't just relevant, it was more relevant than ever before. But also that a lot of things that we would say, we do in church services, or a lot of things about the church that we might think matter, a lot of them don't matter all that much at all. A lot of what the church has been as much about entertaining people, as much about competing with the wider culture, about politics, about power games, and that none of that really mattered. So the things that were really worth being the church for were these much older, much more primal reasons that weren't always the reasons why people were talking about church or going to church.
I'm glad that we're asking some of these questions, because I believe, especially in our Western culture, we have thought of church so much as the institutions that we've seen. Mm-hmm. But as you know, theologically, as a pastor, the early years of the Christian church, there were no institutions. It didn't look like the institutions we have in our Western culture, and in many areas of the world, it doesn't. And yet, Jesus cares about this. So, what have some of the theological perspectives on this whole thing of church been that you've come to as you've had to wrestle with all this?
Yeah, I think for a lot of us, the church was seen as an institution, as an organization with leadership teams and chains of command and a good Sunday show. But yeah, the global church historically and still presently, and certainly the early church, shows us that the church functioned more like a family. Mm-hmm. It was about people living in shared space, people living in shared parish life, people gathering around tables. And there are elements that we participate in today that certainly would have been in the church through a time and space. Gathering on Sundays, gathering for communion, praying, fasting, like all of these things are ancient in the church and well worn. But we've tended to kind of stop often at that, kind of saying there's Sunday and we tithe and there's a leadership team and there's a pastor who puts up the podcast, but that's kind of where church ends. And what we're finding, especially among younger people, is that those who choose to participate in the church are not interested in just a Sunday show. They're mm-hmm. not interested in showing up somewhere and being given simply, here's the words that you need to live by or what you have to listen to. In my experience, the younger people that want to be involved in church are doing it because they want this to be at the core of their life, at the core of their identity, is being in this family of people that is as present at a coffee shop or at the park as it is in the sanctuary on Sunday, that this is a lived reality and a lived family life as the church. And that is both more costly and more challenging and more dangerous, but also more beautiful.
We have said, many of us, that the church is not a building, the church is people. But you are talking about what that really means. If we believe that the church is not a building, that it's people, then it has to be the elements that you've talked about. It cannot be, an hour or two on the weekend with a certain structure. It has to be life. I believe that's what Jesus really intended. Why do you think, in light of all of this, any thoughts about what has kept the church going for 2,000 years? Because it's certainly not looking the same as it did. It shouldn't. It's a different world. And it certainly has been opposed from many different directions. So what is the core here that's kept it going for 2,000 years?
I mean, the short answer is like the Holy Spirit. That's
Sure.
probably
Yep.
the accurate answer. But I think that, whatever structure the church has taken, both good and bad, compromised and flourishing, there are elements that manage to sneak their way through. So any group of people who gather for church are eventually going to get to the point where they disappoint each other, where they accidentally, hopefully, but accidentally hurt each other, where somebody says something that leaves somebody else feeling defensive or feeling wounded. And in that moment, they've got to make the decision. Are we going to go our separate ways, or are we going to learn about forgiveness? The beautiful thing with the church is that we follow Jesus, who teaches us a lot about forgiveness. And so, you might have, and even the grandest megachurch that from the outside looks like it's a big show, and there's lights and there's sound and there's smoke machines, and there's not a lot of relationality. But even in those kind of largest of structures, you still got people sitting down together who are going to accidentally hurt each other and inconvenience each other and say, can we forgive one another? You're going to have people coming to the table together. You're going to have people praying for one another. You're going to have people saying, do you want to come over to my house for small group on Tuesday? And I'm going to invite you into my space, and I'm going to listen to you, and you're going to listen to me, and we're going to form some kind of relationship. And we were strangers previously. Almost every church is going to be full of people that would never pick each other out of a catalog. These aren't the dream team of people. These are, people that have all their own issues. These are people that are doubters. These are people that are, most of us are losers. And yet when we come together, we're with people that we didn't choose to be with. They were chosen for us, or we were chosen into it by Christ. And so, it doesn't really matter what the structure of the church looks like. These deeper, truer elements of the Christian faith and Christian community, in my experience, find themselves popping up even in unexpected places. But that doesn't mean that we can't do things to cultivate the kind of space or the kind of community where these beautiful elements of the Christian faith can more naturally grow and kind of grow from the bottom up, become something that quite organically finds life.
Talk about people not choosing each other out of a catalog. Think of Jesus' disciples. They certainly wouldn't have chosen each other out of a catalog. I mean, anything but. Some of them would have,
he's calling, and we can learn a lot from even how he does that. He calls, a zealot who would have been known as somebody who wants to, fight, maybe even kill those who compromise with the Romans who are ruling over them. And he also calls a tax collector, who is the guy that has compromised with the Romans ruling over them. So he begins his ministry by saying, like, hey, you guys, but from any worldly standard, you guys would hate each other, right? Okay, great. Come follow me. You're going to eat together. You're going to sit together. You're going to listen. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be hard conversations. It doesn't mean that you're not going to be changed by this. Zacchaeus, who was a tax collector, his repentance is tied to not only him undoing his the ways that he has been taking advantage of others, but ultimately giving his allegiance no longer to Rome but to Christ. Mm-hmm. So there's going to be a cost for all of us as we follow Jesus. But I believe that we discover that cost, and we discover what it means to follow Jesus in community. Jesus didn't say to the 12, I got a test for you, and if you pass it, then you can come follow me. The only test was, do you want to follow me? Are you willing to drop what you've got and come with me? And as you follow me, Christ is, I think, saying, as you follow me, you're going to encounter one another, and you're going to become the people who the Holy Spirit uses to transform one another.
Mm. What have you seen that look like, Kevin, in the church you lead, Eucharist Church? Any just little vignette or two? I love some of those that you build into the book, but just share one or two of what that has looked like in your place.
I mean, for us, it looks like bringing together people from this city who are in different economic brackets. We have people in our church who are being outpriced by all of the people that are moving into the city. We are in a historically impoverished city that now has a whole bunch of new people moving into it. And so some of the people in our church are people that moved to the city and bought a house, and others in our church are people that are being priced out of the city because of people who are moving in and buying houses. And so a topic like gentrification, that's incredibly complicated. How do you create a city that is affordable and accessible to everyone? And so, those are the kind of questions we've had to ask. And yet, if we polarize and say, well, the people that are buying houses are going to be a part of this church, and the people that are getting, their landlords are selling their properties are going to live in this house, all we've done is remove people from one another. But when they can get together and they can say, okay, you guys are inheriting this new city and you have certain resources. Others of us have less financial resources, but we have different kinds of resources. How do we become on one team? How do we become tied together so that now it's not enough for me to have my house? I need to make sure everyone in my church has safe, affordable housing. For many in our church, that looks like living in community, living with housemates, learning to share life together under a common roof. Or living on the street together and looking out for people on that street, learning to advocate for those who maybe don't have as much of a voice, learning to share our resources with one another. It would be very easy in a city like ours to say, when we're talking about affordable housing, we've got two sides, and those two sides are going to hate each other. But we believe that Jesus is calling those two sides into one new family. And not only that each side is going to be the point of sanctification for the other. That, and you see that in the early church with the Jew and Gentile, with the male, female, with the slave and the free, that the free man needs to realize that he is a slave to Christ. And so the way he treats his servant is going to be directly reflecting the way that Christ has treated him, which Paul hints in Philemon is going to ultimately mean that you should treat them not only as a brother, but you might want to grant them their freedom. And this is in a culture where that kind of slavery would have been incredibly common as having a car and using gasoline is in our culture. So this is no small ask. But the slave is also told by Paul, you are free in Christ, that you do not serve any person. You've been given your freedom. And so, you get these slaves and these masters looking at each other saying, how is this other person going to teach me about Jesus? And how is that going to reframe our relationship? They become the point of salvation for one another. We see that with the Jew and Gentile, and we see that with men and women in the early church. And so I think the question for us, the church has often said, well, which side are we going to be on, or who is going to be in and who's going to be out? The way that the church has often treated people of color, the way the church has often treated the poor, the way the church has often treated members of the LGBTQ plus community. Whenever it's been, these are the people in and these are the people out, we are missing God's opportunity to transform us through the presence of the other. And so I see that kind of table fellowship as being incredibly core to not only what the church is doing, but core to what Jesus was doing in the first century among his context and his culture.
That's powerful. I know you have also been talking with other churches in your fellowship, especially in Canada and maybe even around the book release. How are you seeing these kinds of ideas either resonate or not resonate with other communities of faith, other churches?
Yeah. I mean, the book's been a great opportunity to talk to followers of Jesus around the world, which has been just incredible, to get that kind of wide scope picture. But I'm also very much a believer in parish and a believer in the local. And so while I'm grateful to get the opportunity to speak in and hear from people around the world, I'm most interested in how does this live itself out in my own backyard with the other churches that are, within a couple of miles from me that are in our city, but who, we're different from. These are churches that we have a network in Hamilton of churches called True City, which is a network of like 20 plus, 25-ish churches. And we're talking like Anglican, Episcopalian, Pentecostal, Conservative Baptist, Liberal Baptist. Like we are talking churches from all over the spectrum, with still plenty of room for even more diversity. But even with what we have, it's not a comfortable space to be in always. You're going to sit down with a Reformed church and a Pentecostal church and an Anglican church and a Catholic church. And you're going to, Greek Orthodox people are present sometimes. And you're thinking, how can we find a unity that is deeper than our uniformity? Because we're never going to have a uniformity here. So if this becomes about fighting over who's right and who's wrong, we're all going to lose. But if we can become, again, the place where God sanctifies each other, the place where iron sharpens iron, where what we learn from the other is going to help us understand ourselves more, and what we're going to learn from another church is going to help us understand our own church more. suddenly we're able to enter into relationships that are not easy. I promise it is much harder to be in a network with churches that you disagree with. If I was in a network with a bunch of churches where everyone agreed, it would be a lot easier, but also it would be a lot more boring. Being in relationship with people that are different from us, who are still coming around Christ's table, allows us to live out this idea. This is no longer an abstract idea, but we're really in the sandals of Jesus and those first disciples, sitting around saying, Jesus, we from a human standpoint have nothing in common, and yet you're calling us into relationship. And so those are the places where we learn our own blind spots. Those are the places where we discover who we uniquely are and who we are not called to be. Those are the places where we see what God is doing beyond our own little community. And so for all of the challenges of that, there's so much opportunity, and it has been worth it time and time again to enter into those difficult kinds of places.
One thing your response right then illustrated was the idea of the church being called to a locality. The early years when Paul was traveling, it was the church in Corinth, the church in Thessalonica. It wasn't like there were, half a dozen or 50, different communities that looked and talked and acted alike. It was everything, all different kinds of people. And the thing they had in common was they were following Jesus.
Yeah. And do you think they had any conflict?
We know they did.
We know they had a fair amount. Yeah. And so why should we ever be surprised that this is difficult? That this is painful, that this is, that's the story of the church. That's the story of Christ's reconciliation of all things.
This is a unique time to be talking about the church, depending on who's listening and where they are. The church that you go to may be meeting in person. They may not be meeting in person with this pandemic. If you are meeting in person, it very possibly looks and feels somewhat different than it has in the past. Mm-hmm. So I think this season perhaps provides a helpful opportunity to even ask some of these very questions about what it means to be church. In our century, in our world, the church has certainly faced troubles and pandemics in the past. What has this looked like where you are, and how have you thought about church in the middle of this COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah. Well, Carol, I will tell you that it has not been my favorite time because, quite frankly, everything I love about church is gross. Everything I like about church is gross. It's passing the peace, which is just passing the germs. It's a shared cup with toddlers and people that walked in off the street doing intinction, just dipping their grubby little fingers right into the pool of juice. It's hugging people. It's singing songs and spitting your spittle all in the air. Church is disgusting. And that's all my favorite parts. So, this time now where we can't be as embodied together has been very difficult, and very funny that I released a book about why would anyone go to church at the only time in human history when literally no one is allowed to go to church.
It is.
That timing just killed me. And yet, I think when this started, I heard all these people talking about how online church numbers were so high and wow, this is the new frontier for outreach. And all of those people have gotten strangely quiet in the last few months. Because I think what we realized is there might be a burst of attention around the novelty of online church, but really watching a YouTube video or trying to squint at the Zoom screen, this is not church. This is not church. This is not what any of us love about it. Even if you love the sermon and you can get a sermon on a video, it's different when your preacher, she's not looking at you. She's not in the room with you. She's not receiving energy from you. So suddenly you realize, all the things that we thought we liked about church, maybe even the things that we said we liked about church, were not the real reason that church was so transformative. Last night I got to go around a campfire with a group from our church who were working through some big issues together. And we started by doing a liturgy together and then breaking bread and having communion. And we did it safe, separate from one another and chopped up the bread. But at the end of it, we were sitting around the campfire and we just started crying. Like all of us were wiping away tears at just the feeling of breaking bread and saying, this is Jesus calling us into this. Christ is with us here around this campfire. And that the incarnated, embodied reality of church is the church. I hope, if anything, this season has put to death the idea that church can be captured online. It can't be. It may be a necessary stopgap. It may be a way to say, while imperfect, it's what we have right now, and that's great. But this is no replacement. This is not the future of church. I actually think the future of church that is being revealed through this time is smaller gatherings that are hyper in person, maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe 30, maybe in backyards, maybe in parks, maybe in church buildings. We have a church building. We're going to be meeting in it again in this fall. But that those aren't going to be us attempting to just replicate what we did before. I don't want us to come in and just do a bad version of the church service we loved before, because now we can't sing and we're all wearing masks. We've got 60 kids in our church under the age of 7. We can't go back to what we had before. So I think this is a season for us to say, what about church truly matters to us? And what about church do we have to grieve? We just have to say it's gone for now, and we're sad. No silver lining, just death. We miss hugging. We miss dipping bread together into the wine. We miss the kids running around. And we name it and we say, this is a hard time, but the church has been through pandemic before. The church has been through hard times before. And just because we're North Americans and we're kind of the most brittle people ever.
Yes, we are.
Right? We're like, oh, struggle. It's like, well, we're not called to war. No one's chopping our heads off. So maybe our little brittle spirits, while I acknowledge that pain is real, we also have to put it in its context and say, we are not the first time that the church has gone through this. This will not be the last time. And this is our cross to bear. We miss what it was. And for this season, we will miss it. And then I think to say, what about church that we truly love is accessible in this time? What can we do? Maybe what can we do that we couldn't do before? Instead of trying to recreate what was, can we do something entirely different for the next year, maybe the next 2 years, and allow God to teach us through this season of wilderness lessons that we couldn't learn when the building was packed and the budget was being met.
Yep. A great perspective. I see this as an opportunity as well. If we, as the people of God, can get away from the idea that a church is a production on Sunday, it will have been a positive thing that perhaps God can bring out of this. More life and less spectator. More real, more person to person, which is, Jesus didn't call his followers to a church service. He didn't say, go therefore and make members of your church to gather on Sundays. He said, go and make disciples, followers of me. And perhaps this can help us wrestle with what that looks like, regardless of our circumstances.
Absolutely. Love it. And yeah, to not try to transcend our circumstances. That's such a kind of Western impulse, is how do we make this, we can transcend it. We can still grow even in this time, and I think that we've got to be able to say, this is our circumstances. And as you said, the relationships are going to be different, and that's okay. But I think the church is so used to onward and upward growth mentality. This is going to keep getting better and better and better. And that's just not what we see in Scripture or church history, for that matter.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, thank you for talking about this, for wrestling with what it means to follow Jesus and helping others see exactly that. We'll make sure that links are available for your book, Why Would Anyone Want to Go to Church, available in the show notes. But if somebody wants to connect with you and find out more, where should they go?
So I do all the social media stuff, except, not TikTok. I'm not on there yet, but I'm on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, and people can follow and write me on there and would love to connect. Go to my website, kevinmakins, makins.com. And on there, I've got links to podcast series and videos we've done and speaking tours and all sorts of stuff that we've worked on before, as well as the book, which is the newest thing and the thing that, I hope people read and I hope they love.
Well, bless you and the work you do for his kingdom, your family, the people you serve, and what God has yet to do with and through you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.
God designed us to grow in community. You may have heard me say that before. And church is so key in that. I know I was challenged by reading some of Kevin's materials and by our conversation. I pray you were as well. If church has been something that you have struggled with, let me first acknowledge those very real struggles. It's very possible that church has hurt you, but that does not mean it's worth giving up on. Like a family, it's messy, but these are our brothers and sisters for eternity. This is God's idea, not mankind's, not humankind's. So it's worth wrestling with church, perhaps especially in the middle of this pandemic. I pray that this has challenged you in some good ways. If you have questions about this or any of our podcast episodes, love to hear from you. drcarolministries.com/podcast. I know Kevin Makins would love to hear from you as well. You can find the links to his website, his social media, and his book, Why Would Anyone Go to Church, in the show notes for this episode. I also want to invite you to our online community. Even if you are part of a church, and I hope that you are, I sincerely hope that you are investing in your community of faith in whatever dimension you can, even in the middle of this pandemic. But sometimes there are challenging issues that are difficult to address in that kind of setting. And in dealing with that, I'd love to invite you to Fully Alive Group, fullyalivegroup.com. That is an online community where we address some of those tough questions like anxiety and depression and mental health issues, marriage, intimacy, sexuality, and things related to that, toxic religion, and how do we keep growing in this messy church scenario, and a wide variety of other challenging issues. I show up there every week by video, and you get increased contact with me that way, as well as a lot of other benefits. FullyAliveGroup.com. Love to have you come and join us there. Thank you for being part of our podcast family. I think about you and pray for you. And until next time, may God bless you.
Thank you for listening to Relationship Prescriptions with Dr. Carol. Our purpose is to provide trustworthy resources that help you and others live fully alive in every way as God intended. If you would like to help others experience transformation in their lives and relationships, we invite you to partner with us. Text the word GIVE, that's GIVE, to the number 512-980-1620. Or visit our website at drcarolministries.com/donate to make a one-time contribution or monthly gift. Your financial support allows us to expand our message and to help others. Thank you so much, and may God bless you.